Today's COVID update is brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price but stay for the service.
And welcome back. We are joined for our first conversation this morning by a pair of chief executive officers who will be discussing with us the protocols in place for the reopening of the northern and western borders. That being said, in studio with us this morning is CEO Nicole Solano of the Ministry of Tourism and Diaspora Relations. Good morning, CEO.
Morning, Isani. Morning, Marlene. Good morning, Belize.
Joining us virtually via Zoom is CEO Dr. Julio Sabido from the Ministry of Health and Wellness. Good morning, CEO Sabido.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
The reopening of our land borders, long in the making, I should say. A lot of people have been waiting patiently to be able to get the opportunity to travel into Guatemala and into Mexico. Let's begin by, first of all, sharing with us what the process has been like in terms of being able to agree upon a date and to be able to commence or to resume, the travel across our borders.
Well, Isani, as you know, it's been almost 2 years. So next month will make 2 years since Belizeans haven't been able to cross either the north or any of our land borders. We were here about 8 months ago talking about the opening of the land borders for tourism. And now finally at the stage where Belizeans will be able to cross. So we're very excited about that today, and a lot of work has been put into making sure that we're ready to open safely. My colleague, Dr. Sabido, the CEO for Ministry of Health, along with all of our other partners, we've been working very hard to flesh out all of the standard operating procedures and be ready for today.
There's several agencies or ministries responsible here. Of course, tourism with the responsibility of border management, Ministry of Health because there are COVID protocols involved, and then there's also immigration that is involved in being able to process people as they pass. What is the area that is the most challenging?
Well, let me say, first of all, the Border Management Agency is responsible for administering all of these agencies. So we manage the facilities at the north, the west, San Pedro and Punta Gorda. Right now we're focused mostly on the northern border because that's where the majority of the Belizeans will be crossing. We're talking about immigration, customs as well as Baja. The health, of course, Ministry of Health. There's police and BDF as well at the border points. And I know I'm forgetting one. Who am I forgetting? Dr. Sabido?
Orisa?
Yes, they're with Baja. So all of the agriculture aspect is a part of the entry at the border points. When you're talking about seaports, Belize Port Authority as well is included. So all of these agencies have their own roles to play, and you asked the question, what is the most, or which would be the most challenging? It's more about being able to coordinate all of these entities because each of them have their role to play, which are very important in the exit and entry of people moving across border points. No?
So in 2020, the terminology new normal came out, right? I think we abandoned it because this just feels like regular life. But the process of traveling across the border now is going to be completely different from what we used to do before March 2020. So this will be a first-time experience for people. How do we educate people as to what to expect when they get to the border crossing, especially land at the north or west?
The biggest difference is the health requirements. So for Belizeans departing, they will have to have the requirement of the vaccination card, and that is a function of immigration. So before they actually leave, they'll have to show that they have their immigration vaccination card.
Double vaccinated.
Correct.
Okay.
In order to depart. Now on entry, that's where the biggest difference lies. Prior to being processed from immigration, they have to pass a health screening. So this is something I think that a lot of people are already accustomed to, right? We're accustomed to, like you mentioned earlier, the new normal. So they will have to, everybody who arrives at the land border will have to test on arrival. And so that happens before they get to immigration. Health will do their checks, they will do their screening, they will see to it that if the person stays for an overnight, they will go into a special line to test. If they depart and return within the same day, then they can pass without testing on to immigration. So that is the biggest change.
So the testing is about same day travel versus overnight. It's not so much 24 hours. Because if I arrive
Yes.
8 o'clock at night and I leave, I come back across the border 8 a.m., it's not 24 hours, but because it's a different day, I then have to test.
That is correct. I think initially there was talk of 24 hours. However, it is not as easy to check for the hour that you departed and arrived. So health decided that it would be on the same day of entry and exit, or exit and entry. You don't have to test. Once it is at another day, whether it's the next day or any following day, then testing would be required.
Let's get Dr. Sabido in on the conversation at this point. Perhaps you can also provide some clarity on this matter from your end as the Ministry of Health.
I think C.E.O. Solano explained it nicely, but once, with regards to testing, once you overnight, you will be required to test upon re-entry. As C.E.O. Solano just explained, there is, it's difficult for us to determine time. Immigration does not put a time stamp on the passport. So for us at health, it would be difficult to determine 24 hours or more. So we decided to go with overnight. But
So
there will
even
be-
one overnight you have to test.
That's correct.
Okay. Now let me ask.
Overnight. One overnight, two overnights. I mean, the limit is, the limit is one, and anything above that, you will have to test.
So let me ask about children. What is the protocol for children? There is a group of children that can be vaccinated, not all are, and there is, of course, those under 12 who do not have access to vaccines. What's the protocol there?
The protocol is that those 12 and above wanting to exit will be required to present their vaccination card, and they must be fully vaccinated. Obviously, those under 12 we will not be requiring any proof of vaccination. There are no vaccines for that age group currently in country, so we cannot demand that from that age group.
And will children be subjected to testing upon their return?
They will be subjected to testing. I think the protocol says 2 and above. It's the same thing that international standards are requiring.
Now, the question about the potential of having COVID before you even leave the country is one that I know people have been asking. Will you be turned away if you show up to the border and you are symptomatic? I have a flu and I'm trying to get across the border.
Immigration will not be screening for any signs or symptoms. I mean, that's not their purview, and we will not have health at the point of exit. Though, and I'm glad you brought that up, we are recommending that people with flu-like symptoms do not travel. Because upon entry, even if it's for one day, and health screens them and they have signs or symptoms, they will be required to test.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Sabido. I go over into Guatemala or Mexico, spend a night or two, and upon my return to our border, I get tested and I return positive for COVID-19. I live in Belize City. What happens at that point? Do I go into quarantine elsewhere? What takes place at that point?
No, you will be required to quarantine at home. I mean, we don't have any quarantine facilities for Belizeans at the moment. You will be required to go home, quarantine there, and quarantine isolate at home.
Okay, if I could add to that, what about the issue of persons traveling on public transportation? So you're tested positive or whatsoever, you're telling me that I can get home and quarantine at home, but I'm traveling by bus. What takes place there?
I think the Ministry of Health will have to have something in place. Dr. Diaz alluded to something to this in one of your interviews last week, that they will have to either take a gold standard cab or something to get home, especially those traveling on public transportation, because I mean, it poses a risk for the rest in the public transportation vehicle.
Yeah. I just wanted to add, Isani, to that point, and I think that indeed Dr. Diaz did mention that in planning to depart the country, it is going to be, the responsibility will be placed on the traveler. You have to realize that in crossing the border, you may incur additional expenses beyond what you expect if you test positive on return. And that screening will be able to determine, you know, how you move depending on your mode of transportation. If you have flu-like symptoms like Dr. Sabita mentioned, it's not in your best interest to go, because maybe you'll have COVID or you might turn out to test positive and then have to incur those additional expenses upon return. So
I'm really interested in this. Something has to be done when you test positive. This is very naturally a situation that you went through many different options. At one point, I know with air travel, there were designated hotels that were allowed for positive persons to quarantine. I'm just thinking, you know, paying for a gold standard hotel, let's say I'm from Cayo, a gold standard taxi, to take me back to Cayo because I am knowingly positive is an incredible expense. Have you looked at all other options to perhaps ease this situation?
well, let me say in terms of the quarantine hotels, that is still in place for tourists. So there's a differentiation between a foreign national and a Belizean who can come and quarantine at home. If there's a foreign national that tests positive on arrival, they obviously have no home to go to. So there's a list of gold standard hotels that are willing to receive positive tourists for the purpose of quarantine. So that is in place. Now, to your point on the cost, yes, indeed it is, which is why Belizeans have to take that, you know, that precaution and know that if they're not willing to make an investment like that, that is the current regulation, because you cannot have someone who has tested positive return to that you know that is known a known positive case return to a public transportation.
Of course, of course. And if I'm the only one who tests positive in my family trip,
similarly,
I will have to separate from them.
That is the current regulation according to health.
Marlene, but just to add to the cost of the taxi that you were saying, if you look, they will have to quarantine for 10 days. So going to be more costly to stay at the hotel for 10 days.
True, true. I'm trying to figure out if people will have options at that point in time. But clearly, you have gold standard taxis who are going to be stationed there for this eventuality. And it's probably going to happen.
Yes. Well, gold standard taxis have been there since tourism opened in June or the end of May, and that will continue. I think the idea really is to remind the public that the borders are open, yes, but there's a lot of conditions. So are you going to take that chance? If you need to move across the border for whatever reason, the border is open and you have the opportunity or the capacity to depart, but knowing that you may have to undergo certain additional conditions if you test positive on arrival.
And Dr. Sabita, what of contact tracing for other persons on the bus, for example, if one person is identified positive?
Sorry, repeat that.
Contact tracing. If someone is sitting next to me on the bus and they test positive, I'm a close contact.
Correct, and contact tracing will be done. It's good that you brought that up, because not only for those on the bus or on public transportation, but it also serve a screening upon re-entry also serves as a form of enhanced surveillance. So, for example, if I go out and I have flu-like symptoms, no one catches it. When I come back in, I am going to be tested and I will know my status then. If I was sitting next to someone, then I will have, I mean, health will do that screening, which the questions are part of the screening, and they will be required to identify who was sitting next to them.
The
So
thing
that
is, that an endeavor like that, CEO, would only be practical if there's like a manifest where you have a list of the names of the passengers on board the bus. Because if I'm traveling through Orange Walk from Belize City and someone gets on the bus and sits next to me, I wouldn't know who that individual is. That's a perfect stranger, as far as I'm concerned. But if the bus conductor or someone who either administers a ticket or whatsoever gets a name, at least you'd have a starting point, a name and a seat number or what have you, then you'll have a starting point.
Yeah, you're perfectly correct. And sorry, I'm taking note of that because it is a very good recommendation that we will have to iron out with health and transport and maybe tourism.
So I just wanted to mention, currently, with local transportation throughout the country, there is no, and to Dr. Sabido's point, there is no surveillance. There's no testing. So there are people that move across the country right now on public transportation that have no idea if there's someone sitting next to them who is testing positive.
Yeah.
In this case, or do they know if they are positive?
Yeah.
So in moving across the border, it is an extra line of defense for testing and surveillance, so that there is then the opportunity to know, whether you're positive or negative. Now, as Dr. Sabido said, I don't know that they're actually at the point of doing the contact tracing and having a manifest of those people aboard public transportation crossing, but the health has said that they have to wait. You have to wait for your results. And so if everybody's on the bus, that is also another way in which to know, well, I was sitting next to this person, I need to look out. I tested negative, but I need to monitor myself for symptoms or test in a few days if I feel I was particularly vulnerable to catching COVID by sitting next to them, no?
Yeah. Now let's dive into the testing protocol. Of course, the biggest criticism is the cost of the test upon return. And this is, of course, you get tested. Once you've spent an overnight, if you're coming back the following day, you will be required to test. The cost of the test is the $100. Was there any consideration given to allowing people to test in Mexico and bring a result over with them?
No, there's no consideration for that, Marlene. We had that issue when, I don't know, about a year ago, and people were falsifying results. People were coming across with results that people just bought and they didn't actually take the test. I hear you about the cost, but what we have to take into consideration is that in that cost is built in the use of PPEs by the provider, overtime, transportation, logistics, the hiring of staff. So, I mean, it's a personal responsibility. If someone wants to go over and they're willing to pay, then, well, obviously they have to be willing to pay if they're going to spend the overnight.
Is there, so, to you, Dr. Sabido, I think part of the concern, and some may say it's even controversial, is the fact that it's one particular provider who will be taking care of administering these tests at the border versus being able to get tested from any other medical company, if I could use that expression.
Yeah. Well, this was put out to tender last year, Sunny. And it was put out to tender to all those eligible. I think there were about 17 companies that were eligible to bid, and only two provided a bid at that time. You can't fault the process. The process was followed.
All right.
Well, let me come back to this for a moment, because the testing at the border, as you said, the concern was that people would falsify their report. In other words, they'd buy a piece of paper that says they are negative for COVID and bring it in. But that it can also be argued that can be done at the airport, where there is air travel. So what makes the tourists coming in on an airplane eligible to bring a report that you trust versus someone coming over from Mexico or Guatemala?
Well, I think it's more based on the experience. We haven't had, at least as far as I know, that experience at the PGIA. People have to present it, and if we suspect it's at the PGIA, if we suspect it's false, then they have to prove. We have had those instances at the land borders, and not only one or two times. It's been numerous times that people have been caught with false results.
I just want to comment that I think things will change over time. This is the case currently, and something that we have been trying to see what we can do is to standardize all the entry requirements across all border points. So PGIA has been open the longest, and even the protocols at PGIA have evolved over months, and they've gone back and forth depending on the situation with COVID. And I know that that is one of the things that we want to see happen. We want to see the standardization of protocols, because it is confusing from a tourism standpoint. It's confusing for travelers if they know, well, if I come through this port, it's one, requirement. If I come through another, it's a different requirement. So it is something that we want to eventually get at. I think Dr. Sabido's point is one that is important to note, that at this time, that is what is needed at the land borders, but it may change. As you know, a lot of destinations are removing testing requirements right now. It doesn't mean that Belize just follows suit. Belize has to look at its own unique situation and determine what to do. But we are, from a tourism standpoint, looking at what our competing destinations are doing, and we continue to raise that with help to see where we need to go in that regard.
What's the compromise there? Is it the same protocol for tourists traveling overland?
Yes.
So they test at the border?
Yes, all tourists, and that has been the case since the borders have been open. I noticed you were showing some images. Those images are actually from this morning. It really was only over the weekend that a lot of changes occurred at the northern border, so that testing can now happen up at the pre-screening area by OIRSA. Before, testing happened down at the main building, but now the capacity to screen and test has been moved up to that pre-screening area. Everybody would need to test, whether you're a foreign national or a Belizean. The testing on arrival is standard across the board.
How many people are going to be deployed at the border? Because I'm thinking you have 2 buses that pass. That's what, 100 people minimum?
Let's
say
just
64 persons per bus.
Yeah.
And a 2-seater.
well
About 120.
Yeah. I want to say that the images that we shared from this morning are all private vehicles, because I was in touch with the CEO from the Ministry of Transport, who has informed me that this week they are doing the discussions and negotiations with the bus lines, right? So you should not see today buses passing. Right now you will see, they told me it was like 6:10 this morning, and I had heard that 15 cars had already passed. So people are moving early, and they're already moving, no? But we don't, I think we will have a couple days to test the system as well before you see that large influx of passengers.
So public transportation isn't allowed to cross the border as yet?
According to the information I have, that is being resolved this week.
Okay.
Yes.
What you've described, excuse me, what you've described earlier is what we would term a multi-sectoral or multi-agency approach to reopening the border. And you've discussed the tourism aspect, and Dr. Sabido has discussed the medical or the health aspect. What has been the conversation with your partners in terms of the Ministry of Agriculture, in terms of the Customs and Excise Department and the Immigration, in terms of the roles that they will play respectively?
Well, I have been, we have meetings. So the last meeting that we had with all of the agencies was on Friday to really just go through what the protocols would be. As you know, the SI came out on Friday as well. And Immigration, I know, is very, very excited to have that flow back. And they are now no longer at the pre-screening area where they were over the last 8 months, but back in the main building. They are going to be the agency responsible for checking that Belizeans have their vaccine card to exit. So that is the only additional responsibility, if you will, for Immigration on the departure for Belizeans. Customs pretty much remains the same. as well as Baja, they're checking for the same thing, police and BDF. Things have been slow at the borders. So now we're going to another level of activity, not yet at the level of pre-pandemic, but slowly increasing activity. And I think for the most part, the feedback that I have, everybody is excited and happy to see more movement at the border points.
So let me just get some more clarity here with the allowance for travel across the border. We said fully vaccinated, which means 2 shots, and 2 weeks of since your last vaccination. What about people who use the medical letter saying they're recently recovered from COVID, therefore not fully vaccinated? Is that valid?
My understanding that yes, but
Dr. Sabido?
We are discussing that. I think we were going to finalize that tonight with the medical response team at the meeting, medical response team. But it is indeed fully vaccinated. Obviously, if you had COVID and you can prove it, then we will have to take that into consideration. But like I said, that will be finalized tonight. I wanted to clarify something though. Oh, you asked about the capacity of testing. It's my understanding that the provider will have around 18 to 20 people doing swabbing at the border, at the northern border.
How many?
18 to 20.
18 to 20 on a daily basis.
Correct.
Okay. Now, I hear you say, Dr. Sabido, that you'll be meeting, and I believe C.E.O.s Solano, you spoke of transport also working out these details. I'm very sure viewers are watching and saying, you've had 2 years to figure out this protocol. What's the delay in being able to fine-tune all these details? Let's start with you, Dr. Sabido.
Well, I think the delay is that this is a dynamic situation, Marlene. Nothing is written in stone, and as C.E.O. Solano said earlier, this can easily change in the next 2 weeks, that we might either relax it or we might make it more stringent. But I think the long and short is that COVID is very dynamic. I mean, look at, we came from Delta, now we're at, we had Delta the last, and then now Omicron, which is, I don't want to say less, but it is more infectious, yet it is not as severe.
Yeah.
I don't want the viewers to take misconstrue the term less severe, but for lack of a better term right now, it is less severe. But I mean, as I said, the virus evolves, and so our protocols have to evolve.
No, I echo the sentiments of Dr. Sabido. Things are changing, and I think that it is important for us to start the process. We won't have everything perfectly in place in order to open the borders. So as we know from when we opened for tourism at the beginning of, or the end of May, things changed, things evolved. We had to monitor the situation and make adjustments, and that will be the case now as well. I don't think that the intention was ever to just open the doors, It has to be a cautious, progressive opening, and that is what you're seeing.
Are we relying exclusively on rapid results for COVID upon re-entry? As you know, the Ministry of Health has a process in place that if you are symptomatic, you get a rapid test, but you also get a PCR and isolate until you get those results.
Upon entry, we are relying only on rapid tests, but you will be, so health will be there screening, and will, you take your rapid test if you're symptomatic, day traveler, I'm talking about. And they tell you, okay, you're in your private vehicle, you go home, you should go and do a PCR. But that will be when you get to your final destination, your town, your community of residence, right? To make sure and to rule out that it is indeed not COVID. It will be the same protocol, but we won't have, at least Ministry of Health will not have anyone doing PCR at
the border.
You've acknowledged that this is a fluid and dynamic arrangement, so to speak. How would you grade your state of readiness at this point? I know that perhaps within a week or two, you'd either, as you mentioned, relax or tighten the protocols and the measures to travel across the border. As we speak today, however, how prepared is the Ministry of Health and Wellness?
I'd say about 95% prepared, Isani. And as the days go by, whatever gaps we find, we will make sure that those gaps are bridged. We will close those gaps.
Now, C.E.O. Solano, tell us a bit about the travel that was taking place. There was tourism, but there were also exceptions made for medical travel, business travel. Just how many people actually traveled across the different border points in the past 2 years?
So I just got those numbers from the CEO in immigration. The borders, the northern border in particular, sees an average of 4,000 people per day, right? Prior to COVID. They are expecting that number to be about half of that right now that we're back. In the last year, since the borders opened, it was much less. We were under 1,000 people a day, and that includes Belizeans and tourists, all passengers. So we do expect that slowly the numbers will increase. That is the intention. From a tourism standpoint, we had a discussion before about how important the tourists arriving over the land borders were to our overall tourism numbers. With the change in the protocols now from before it was 8 to 4 on weekdays and 8 to 12 on the weekends, now the opening hours at the borders from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. at night, we do expect additional tourism numbers through the land borders.
Why curfew hours for the border?
Well, I think it is really a matter for testing. The testing facilities have always determined or dictated the hours because you cannot enter if the testing isn't available. So those hours were predetermined when they opened only for tourists, 8 to 12, and then 8 to, on the weekends and 8 to 4 in the week. So now we have a standard 6 to 10 going forward. I'm sure that will open. As you know, borders should typically be open 24 hours. That was the case pre-pandemic, and I think that as time passes, we'll get closer and closer to those.
Okay, so the curfew has more to do with giving the testing site a break in between.
It has, I would say it has to do with all of the agencies and their preparedness and all of the extra measures. Those can be contained within a defined period of time. So the idea, of course, is once measures are relaxed and things are flowing a little bit easier, then you'll probably see an increase in the number of hours. People have typically been allowed to depart outside of those hours because they don't require to test on departure. But for arrival purposes, they need to test within those windows. And immigration and customs, they're there throughout the right. So it's not that the borders close, it's more the availability
entry
of the testing.
Into the country. Because you have to be tested.
Correct.
Or you may have to be tested if you're returning on a different day. You said that the daily travel is about 4,000 persons? Pre-pandemic.
Yes. Close to it was on just a little bit under that.
And if we return to those numbers, can we handle that with testing in place?
I think that people will not. I don't see us returning to those numbers. Those numbers include tourism as well.
Okay.
And a lot of the travel for tourism over the borders is dependent on the charter buses and all of this that haven't returned yet. So we do, from a tourism standpoint, hope to see that growth in that segment as well. It's important to not only the overall tourism numbers, but to some specific segments within the tourism.
What's been the response from tourism standpoint, that is, by travelers having to face these protocols coming into the country, possibly quarantining at a hotel in Belize instead of touring?
It's not easy. I think anybody that travels in a pandemic expects additional protocols, additional wait time, additional screening. It is something that travelers the world over have become accustomed to. Whenever they're moving across borders, there are new measures, and each country has a different protocol or different protocols to follow. We have not seen the return, the return at the land borders as we've seen at the PGIE. Excuse me, the protocols at the land borders are a little bit more stringent than they are at PGIE. As you mentioned earlier, testing on arrival is required at the land borders, whereas you can bring in a negative test at PGIE. That could account for some of the reason why we have seen more along the lines of a 20% recovery at the land borders for tourism and an 80% recovery at the PGIE.
Yeah.
So we're hoping these changes will help us in tourism as well.
And then, I mean, the number of tourists that we've seen traveling over the past year?
We have seen about, pre-pandemic, we were getting about 500,000 roughly tourists through all border points.
Okay.
And in 2021, we were at about 60% of that, right? So we're talking about 300,000, 50%, close to 50%. The recovery was between 40 and 50% projected. And we didn't see those numbers recover at the land border, and that affected overall tourist numbers.
So you recovered at almost 50% without the usual traffic at the land
Correct.
border.
That is right, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I mean, a big part of it, I'm sure you know, is going from a country like Mexico, where regulations are limited. There's a lot more freedom in what you're able to do versus what we have in place in Belize.
Exactly. And I think that was a decision, as we've been saying, we're guided by health and the decisions that are made in order to, put safety in place for Belizeans and travelers. So I think as we go forward, we will see adjustments, and we just make those adjustments.
What considerations, if any, have been made in respect of, if you look at the state of Quintana Roo, they have certain indications based on the prevalence of cases and what have you in that particular state. I think up to last week they were at the amber phase or what have you.
Yeah.
So we're opening our borders when it's arguable that the number of active cases in Chetumal, since it's within Quintana Roo, but it's the primary destination for most Belizeans, it goes as far as Chetumal, that those cases are on the rise there. What considerations are being made for that? Perhaps this is for Dr. Sabito?
Yeah, before I forget what Marlene was saying just now about Mexico not having strict regulations, I just like to remind the viewers that the old adage of when in Rome, do like the Romans. In this case, don't do
that.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Make sure that you continue to practice your public health and social measures. Wear the mask all the time. I'm sure that when they get over there, people might be without mask and they might say, well, I won't use mine. They need to think about themselves and their family and their fellow nationals when they come back home. And so please continue to practice all social measures, public health and social measures when you go over to Mexico or Guatemala.
Yeah.
With respect to the border opening, with respect to the traffic light system that they're using, we're not using that. We were considering it. The medical response team evaluated it. We evaluated the one that was being used by the UK. The UK just, it showed that it didn't work for them. And I think it's not working for Mexico either. They're just reporting it, but they don't do anything about it. As you can see, our numbers, at least for Friday, the trend is that it's going down. We hope that people will continue to be careful, be cautious, and continue to follow the public health and social measures, even over there, so that when they come back, they don't contribute to they don't contribute to increasing the numbers here in Belize.
Now, I like what you said about, I love to know that you considered the traffic light system, and if I could just add there, I think there's one part in whether it works, but there's also the predictability that it builds in for the public and also for businesses as well. But is there a plan in place that if, for example, there is an escalation of cases across the border, or if we start to see that the majority of the tests or a large number of people testing coming in test positive, is there a response system already in place as to changes that may come into effect?
I can tell you that the medical response team will write to the cabinet requesting that they revisit or they reconsider the border, or consider closing of the borders at least temporarily.
There's the medical community is still requesting closing the border.
No, I'm saying that if we see that happen, then I can tell you that the medical response team will advocate for us to close the borders, at least for us to get a handle on the infections.
Well, I just want to add that when we were opening the borders for tourism, there was a lot of questions, a lot of uncertainty, and that's where we are right now. We're at a point where we're opening for Belizeans for the first time in 2 years, and so there will be a need to evaluate. I keep saying that because we can't predict the future. We don't know if there will be another wave, another variant. I mean, there's so much uncertainty. So the only thing we can do is to move forward day by day, step by step, to try and open. Thankfully, in doing that the last time around, we were able to safely open, and we did not see a dramatic issue, right? Yeah. So we're hoping that that is the case again. We're taking all the measures that we know we can take, given all the information and experience that we have. So I am very optimistic that it is a very important and good decision, and as things change, we have the opportunity to change as well.
So what's the positivity rate at the airport?
We are still seeing positivity rate very low. That hasn't changed. It was below 1%. It's still very low, and most of our tourists are coming in with their negative tests, and most of the cases that are found at the airport are Belizeans who tend to be the ones that are testing on arrival more so, no?
Yeah. I mean, it's two different scenarios, because a tourist would, in fact, if I do my test in whatever state I'm from and test positive, I won't come.
Correct.
So that would be a very big difference between getting to the border and having to test there.
And that was one of the things that we were discussing would have been the benefit of having people test prior to arrival. Right now, if somebody tests and they're a foreign national, the first response is to deny entry. So that would have been avoided if we would have been able to accept or have them test prior to coming to the border point. But because it's a land border, which is very different than at the PGIA, they can just turn around and go back, whereas you can't
just... So if a tourist tests positive at the border, they're denied entry?
That is the first response for foreign nationals. But there is the option for them to do quarantine if that is what they wish.
Oh, so they get a choice.
Yes.
You can go back into Mexico or Guatemala.
Correct.
Or go to a quarantine hotel.
Yes.
Yeah, that's that. And we haven't gotten any scathing reviews over that system as yet?
I am not, really there haven't been. Remember, since the borders opened, there was a requirement for testing, and there have only been 1 or 2 cases that I am aware of, and they usually call right away that tourists must return. So it's very, very infrequent.
Yeah. So let's get into some of the closing comments now. As you know, it is not sustainable for the border to be closed. I mean, this is a matter of being able to allow people to move around as they choose to, but doing so safely and keeping public health considerations in place. So let's start with you, Dr. Sabido. Your advice to Belizeans who will make that choice to venture, and I'm sure you've seen all the criticisms and comments and concerns and questions. What's your advice to Belizeans who make that choice to travel across the border?
My advice is that, first of all, if you have flu-like symptoms, don't postpone your travel as much as possible. When you are in either Mexico or Guatemala, please continue to practice your public health and social measures, even if they're not doing it. As I said, it's personal responsibility, and you need to take care of yourself, your family, and those close to you.
CEO?
Well, of course, I want to see safe movement across the border points. As I mentioned earlier, we have seen activity already since 6 o'clock this morning, and I'm sure that that has increased.
I know. I'm
over the
sure
last
people
hour.
were waiting in Corozal to cross early this morning.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. The sentiment is that as of today, we will have a lot of same-day travelers. So I really look forward to that additional movement across the borders. But it's important for us that the movement is done safely and orderly, and that over the coming days and weeks, we will continue to evaluate and make adjustments. So just for the public to realize that if there are adjustments in the public health regulations, to expect that if that is what becomes necessary, no?
Okay, and just to be clear, these are protocols that will be in place at the northern border, western border, and the seaports. We got PG crossing, San Pedro crossing,
Yes.
Dangriga too.
Yes. Well, the border points that we are responsible for at border management are North, West, San Pedro, and PG. So the Port Authority has informed me as well, similar to the situation with transport, that they are in communication this week with those transfer services for international movement across the seaports. So we'll see that start to pick up as well over the coming weeks.
All right, so that rounds out our conversation on the reopening of the borders this morning. We'd like to say thank you to CEOs Solano and Sabido. Thanks for having joined us this morning to share with us additional information on what we need to know going forward. With that, we'll take a commercial break, and when we return, it's Let's Go Belizing. Stick around.
This COVID update was brought to you by Fulltech Systems, your technology center, where you'll come for the price, but stay for the service.